Hello, everybody. Welcome today. My name is Chun Si. I'm actually from the HKU Sustainability Office, work at Long Fushan Environmental Education Center. I'm very glad to be here, very honored. Mike's asked me to introduce our speaker for today. So welcome to this Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum. And again, thank you so much for making it out tonight. So tonight, Dr. Jonathan Mu, he is our speaker. He will be discussing on The Earth, Our Home, Christianity, Ecology, and Global Limits. I was very fortunate to have been part of the discussion earlier today, and I think that he has many wonderful insights that he'll share with all of us tonight here as well. A brief introduction. Dr. Jonathan Mu did his PhD in the Divinity faculty at the University of Cambridge. He also holds previous degrees in biology and English from Lake Forest College, and also in wildlife ecology from Utah State University, and also biblical studies from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. He is currently an associate professor of theology at Whitworth University, and he has also written several books on theology and nature. These include Creation Care, a biblical theology of the natural world, which he wrote with his father, I've learned recently. And also Let Creation Rejoice, Biblical Hope and Ecological Crisis with Bob White. And also Hope in an Age of Despair, The Gospel and the Future of Life on Earth, also with Bob White. And so without further ado, shall we welcome him with a round of applause?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Those last two books are actually the same book with different titles for the US and UK. So I just list them both in my CV to make it look like I've written more than I have. I don't actually do that, but thank you for that introduction. I just want to say, as the others have said, how grateful I am that you're here tonight. I genuinely wondered if this would be canceled just a few minutes ago. So it's great to see you all here. And I look forward to hearing your feedback to this work I'm going to present, which is actually something I started on just a couple of years ago and I'm returning to now. And so I could really use insight and feedback to my talk. So I'll look forward to the question and answer time. I'm really glad, too, to have learned about this Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum, especially as someone who comes from a country where faith and science are still viewed often as mutually exclusive. It's great to know of a work of an institute like this that is pointing to the reality that, of course, historically that has not been the case. They have indeed been collaborators. And especially in our time, I think more than ever, we need faith and science to collaborate. As someone who works a lot on issues of climate change and the environment, I think we desperately need religious people who can understand and engage with science. And we need scientists who are willing to embrace and understand the need for religious and other sorts of narratives to frame our science and ask questions of value that are necessary if we're going to know how to act and what to do. So I'm really excited about the work of this group. And even if you find my lecture tonight rubbish, I hope you come back to the other things that they put on, because it's exciting and important work. I arrived here last Saturday for a few different events and having to leave tomorrow, sadly. It's been a joy to be in Hong Kong for the first time. I have been just amazed by the beauty of this city. I knew about the dense urban core and the incredible architecture of all the skyscrapers and the rich culture here. And I had seen pictures, I think, of some green along the edge, but I hadn't realized how extensive it was. And I've been told that something like 40% of the whole area of Hong Kong has been preserved. And so I've also had fun the last couple of days doing some hiking and exploring the beauty of this place. And the friendliness of people who have welcomed me here this week, too. So I hope this isn't my last time in Hong Kong. It has, of course, been a particularly interesting time to be in this place. And I can say that I have been praying for Hong Kong. We'll go on doing that in the future. One thing I was reflecting on that relates to my lecture tonight is I wouldn't presume to comment on things that are going on here, but underlying some of it, of course, I think must be a sense of belonging. What does it mean to belong to this place? What does it mean to belong to this community? What does it mean to belong or not to belong to China, for example? And my lecture tonight is really about the way our sense of belonging or not to a place and to be passionate about that place where we belong leads to particular ways of being in the world and particular action. So I'm going to talk about a place I do know, which is my home in the western United States. Life where I live has been dominated by a variety of myths about place. And most dominant still to this day, and people in my hometown, are versions of the frontier myth that was invented in the 19th century. In this myth, space and resources are considered essentially limitless, as long as you're hardworking and creative enough to make use of them. The primary virtues of life in where I live are independence, self-reliance, and a libertarian version of freedom that says one can do what one wants to do. If you've ever seen a classic American Western, you'll know what I'm talking about. That's what people still live by to a large extent where I am. But there's actually an alternative myth, one that is less advertised, certainly less exciting to make films about. And that's a version of the myth that Wallace Stegner, a historian of the West, of people that he used to call stickers, those who stuck to a place that they came to love. These were people who reckoned with the limits that were imposed by their place. Where I live, that limit is much to do usually with water. I live in an arid part of the world. And people who learned how to conform themselves to the unique demands of their land, of their place. The idea was that their flourishing and the flourishing of those who came after them would depend on how they acted now in the present. Now, it has to be acknowledged that in both myths, those who'd already been living on the land for millennia were usually conveniently ignored, forced to assimilate, or in some cases even slaughtered. And under both myths, the land itself could suffer, sometimes grievously. I think it's most obvious under the frontier myth because the mentality meant that resources used in one place, it was always assumed that they could be replaced or found somewhere else. It was easy to just move on. And also then easy to evade responsibility for the mess that might be left behind. This is what we live with where I come from in the American West, as the legacy of people who took the resources and left behind the pollution, heavy metals, whatever it might be, as they moved on to the next place. Now the stickers, those who stuck to a place, they couldn't be so reckless as that. But nonetheless, ignorance and greed could mean that the seemingly inexhaustible resources of a place were depleted before anyone noticed. And sometimes the way people dealt with the particularity of a place was to find ways to overcome its limits that too often proved short-term or depended upon the destruction of other places or the depletion of places downstream from them. The temptation of adherents of either myth, and I think for all of us as we think about our relationship to the land, is when faced with abundance to consume abundantly, as Wendell Berry has said, to assume that what is good for us must be good for the world, rather than thinking that what is good for the world perhaps will actually be good for us too. So this project that I'm working on Christianity, ecology, environmental ethics, is prompted by questions of limits. And what I recognize as I began in this project is that limits only make sense. We only embrace limits if they are in the context of belonging to a place or to a community or to ourselves. Otherwise, why would we embrace limits? And this investigation involves disciplines I am no expert in. Economics, I think, looms especially large. And I don't feel like it's my place to try to make grand economic theories, but rather from the perspective of Christianity and the Christian scriptures to simply raise questions about our vision of who we are, where we are, and our place. That might be relevant for people of faith, but also for people not of faith, to at least raise the questions. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. And in fact, what I'll begin by doing is talking about the place of limits in discussions of environmental policy and environmental ethics. I will then look at a particular response to this discussion of limits from people called Eco Modernists. You've probably never heard of this group before, but nonetheless they articulate a particular perspective that is actually widespread in our society, and so I think is necessary to engage with, whether or not we agree with them or not. And then my second half, or maybe last quarter of the talk, will be looking at a particularly Christian vision of limits, just as an example of how they might make sense within the Christian tradition as a place to begin. Traditional environmentalism is based on the assumption and it's rooted in ecological science. It goes back to Alexander von Humboldt, probably actually far before him, actually, that we are a part of a place, that we are part of the interconnected systems of nature. Therefore, for the sake of the flourishing of our life and of other life, both now and in the future, we embrace certain limits to live as a part of those systems. I think maybe the best example of this that might be well known from the 70s is the work of the Club of Rome and their limits to growth. More recently, however, is the Planetary Boundaries approach, which I suspect will be familiar to many of you if you've worked in related disciplines. Here, the aim is to determine safe boundaries within which human activity should be constrained if the Earth is to go on supporting us. So, for example, how much land can safely be brought under cultivation or intensively used without jeopardizing the healthy functioning of the whole? How much fresh water can we appropriate for human use? How much can we safely transform the Earth's biogeochemical flows through our use of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers? According to the most recent update, which is now actually a few years old, of the Planetary Boundaries team, they suggest that we are right at the boundary for land system change. And so we are in a zone of increasing risk as we transform the surface of the Earth. So too with the boundary for climate change. When it comes to biosphere integrity, we are dramatically overshooting the boundary, which just refers, of course, to the profound decline in the abundance and the diversity of other creatures. According to Will Steffen, who's the lead author of this study, transgressing any one of these 9 boundaries, but especially the one for biosphere and the one for climate change, quote, increases the risk that human activities could inadvertently drive the Earth system into a much less hospitable state, damaging efforts to reduce poverty and leading to a deterioration of human well-being in many parts of the world, including even wealthy countries. Now, despite the popularity of these approaches, there are significant difficulties and challenges to the idea that human beings ought to bother to try to live within limits. The Planetary Boundaries approach in particular has been criticized for its attempt to assign global limits for issues that are mostly local in scope. So think about, example, fertilizer use. Human beings are the greatest force on Earth now for the nitrogen cycle, because the amount of nitrogen that we fix from the air, bigger than anything that's happened in 2.5 billion years. So we're playing a huge role there. And the effects of that, we know, are devastating for degradation of the topsoil, for dead zones and oceans and that sort of a thing. But of course, it varies from place to place, from farmer's field to farmer's field, from nation to nation. So for every place that is overusing fertilizers, we might say there are places that actually could use more access to nitrogen fertilizers. I think of parts of Africa, for example. So sometimes the Planetary Boundaries approach is criticized for trying to make what are local issues into global issues. So those have to be disentangled. A more fundamental challenge has been the link with any talk of limits with Thomas Malthus. I think if you read almost any person attacking limits, Malthus ends up coming up, and not in a good way. Malthus argued that human population would eventually hit natural limits, which would lead to starvation and collapse. And such fears of population growth have been implicated in coercive attempts to control reproduction and women's bodies, and also is used by wealthy Westerners simply to shift the blame for environmental problems from their consumption habits to the population growth of the poor in the majority world. So it's been criticized for being associated with such perspectives. It's also the case that many past predictions of when limits would be reached have proven spectacularly wrong. Most infamously, Paul Ehrlich's 1968 population bomb, where he predicted mass starvation, failed to see the way in which the Green Revolution would ensure there was always enough food to feed the world in the decades for which he had predicted massive food shortages. Now, plenty of people did die, of course, in those times, but famine remained in those times, and still is today, a problem of inequitable distribution of food, of injustice and inequity. But nonetheless, the failure of the predictions about food amounts leads to suspicion about our ability to identify limits and whether or not they apply to human beings. Another critique is that discussion of limits is often situated within a romantic view of a harmony of nature, an ordered and orderly vision of the world as generally stable and benign, but also fragile. Well, our aim is to situate ourselves properly within this order to preserve the stability of the earth and to avoid doing harm. Such a view, it's argued, ignores the history of life on Earth, which has been shaped, as we know, by catastrophes and disturbances, from storms to forest fires to volcanoes to meteors to wobbles in the orbit of the Earth. All of this can suggest that chaos, luck, and chance are what determine the outcomes for the Earth's life more than anything else. And that the Earth and its ecosystems, well, I shouldn't say that, but the Earth and its biosphere has been resilient through it all. So what can it mean to live within limits in a world where transgressing boundaries seems the rule rather than the exception? It's also observed that the negative consequences of exceeding limits might not be experienced until sometime in the future. Given that people right now are living in poverty and suffering from what might be considered a lack of, quote, development, would trying to keep humanity within certain limits mean denying the very real and present needs of the poor in favor of the merely possible or probable outcomes in future generations? The question here, of course, is the matter of discount rate. How much do we discount future generations in relationship to the present? And how do we account for the fact that there's always the chance that technology will be developed that will enable us to escape the consequences of our present actions? And then finally, whatever we might think about the hypothetical significance of limits, it seems difficult, and some would actually claim impossible, for people and societies ever to voluntarily choose restraint. Come to America, you might especially feel that way. The very notion of limits stands in the way of modernity's commitment to progress. Our society's pursuit of growth, innovation, and development means that it can seem pointless to even bother talking about limits. Eco Modernism now, which I'm going to talk about, is modern in just this sense. This is the critique with which they begin. You'll notice, not incidentally, you might recognize this city that the eco-modernists used when they released their manifesto, and it fits with some things that we'll see in a minute. Maybe I'll come back to that, why they use that picture. Eco-modernism, which again, has anyone heard of eco-modernism? Nope, I didn't think you probably would have done. It's actually just as well, perhaps, since I'm about to critique them. If I had a strong eco-modernist here, maybe you would fight back. But again, as I said earlier, I think eco-modernism is important only because it articulates things that are often assumed by our societies and by our governments. To be perfectly frank, even the most environmentally conscious leaders that we have had so far, their policies are actually influenced by the thinking of eco-modernism. So Barack Obama, for example, his good environmental policies were in a way shaped by eco-modernist sorts of thinking. So it's sometimes useful to get these out in the open, as these folks do, to see what lies behind their thinking. Eco-modernism is founded on the premise that not only is it naive to think that societies will choose to reject the Western trajectory of development, in other words, everyone's going to want to develop in the same way the West has done, but there actually are not any meaningful limits that need finally constrain us. And so you see here, to the degree to which there are fixed physical boundaries to human consumption, they're so theoretical as to be functionally irrelevant. And eco-modernism actually got its start as a rejection of traditional environmentalism because traditional environmentalists made everyone feel guilty and focused on limits and restraint. So it started with this book by Schellenberger and Nordhaus in 2004, who both incidentally were working for environmental organizations at the time. And they wrote an essay called The Death of Environmentalism, which it was kind of a death that I think they were wanting, they were proclaiming. Their claim is that environmentalism, because it has a negative view of human progress, because it moralizes against technology, is simply wrong and fails to commend itself to enough people to make any difference. Moreover, they said, environmentalism is hopelessly wed to a naive and outmoded view of the harmony of nature. It's not up to the task of dealing with something like climate change. For eco-modernists, even dramatic limits on human consumption would not be enough for significant climate change mitigation, and they would be counterproductive to human development. Therefore, they suggest climate change is simply a technological problem that technology alone can solve. The eco-modernist rejection of limits hinges on a rejection of humanity's entanglement with nature. And it expects that technology can liberate us from any leftover restraints that we might have from the natural world. This is clear from the Eco-Modernist Manifesto that you see here that was published several years ago and signed by a group of academics and activists. This begins with an acknowledgement that the Earth is a human planet. Human beings came from the Earth, but they now remake the Earth as they see fit. Eco-modernists accept the now fairly widely shared notion that we are living in a new age, the Anthropocene, the age of humanity. An age in which we have such a profound impact on the entire planet that we can be compared to a geological force. Now, in popular discussions, and the way most people use the Anthropocene, it tends to have negative connotations, that we're having such a profoundly negative impact on the Earth. But the eco-modernists want to put a positive spin on it. They suggest, in fact, that we embrace our new power over the Earth, that we use it to enjoy a good or even great Anthropocene, as you can see here. They summarize their idea like this. They affirm the idea that humanity must shrink its impacts on the environment to make more room for nature, but they reject the notion that human societies must harmonize with nature to avoid collapse. Incidentally, this is, you can perhaps see why they might use a picture of Hong Kong as their background for their manifesto. Here's what they say. I think, incidentally, that they have some confusion about what they mean by nature here. They perpetuate the nature-culture divide of modernity, but then other times they sort of collapse it. So it's very confused thinking, I'll be frank, about that lies behind some of their documents. But nonetheless, their basic point is clear. The flourishing of wild nature, which is what they call it, requires space set aside from the direct influence of human beings. If such space is to be preserved and left for wild nature, the solution is emphatically not for us to learn better how to live in mutual dependence on the natural world. Rather, it requires a rapid decoupling from nature, thus freeing us from our dependence. Decoupling, of course, happens when environmental impacts on some given resource decline, even as economic growth continues. And eco-modernists observe that we have observed some examples of decoupling. For example, carbon dioxide emissions. They continue to rise rapidly. Certain countries, even when you account for their exported emissions, which is how the UK tends to get away with lots of things, even when you account for that, nonetheless, there has been a relative decoupling, economic growth growing faster than emissions. So they point to that and suggest that simply needs to be accelerated, that sort of decoupling. At bottom, eco-modernists say, it is the continued dependence of humans on natural environments that is the problem for the conservation of nature. The aim is to transcend planetary boundaries and to flourish into the deep future. That's a quote. And in case this all seems hypothetical, I just want to show you a few practical implications that they advocate for in light of this. First, you might be aware, I know some of you will be, the debate sometimes between conservation biologists about land sparing versus land sharing. Is it better for us to learn to share land with other species by making our farms and cities more amenable to the flourishing of other life? Or should we focus our efforts instead on sparing some land from human impact by intensifying actually our agriculture and use elsewhere? The eco-modernists, as you might guess, advocate for land sparing, doing agriculture more intensely, having dense cities, while sparing some land for wild nature. In fact, they actually spend much of their time arguing against forms of land sharing. In other words, using the land that we do use for agriculture in cities better, because they feel like to not do that intensely is not to leave enough space for what they call wild nature. This is why Hong Kong, right? The picture of Hong Kong is of a dense urban core surrounded by preserved forest. And so they don't show the farmland that's perhaps necessary to feed Hong Kong in their pictures, but nonetheless, that image is kind of the one that captures, I think, their vision in a way. Eco-modernists acknowledge that some people might choose, just personal preference, to live lifestyles that are more connected to the natural world. But they actually think if people were to adopt that on a large scale, it would destroy nature, because it has a much higher per capita impact on the environment. So they are very critical of traditional agriculture, of agrarianism. They're strongly opposed to organic farming. They advocate, again, intensive, large-scale agriculture. They sometimes acknowledge the problems of overuse of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, degradation of the soil, and all of that. But they simply are convinced that eventually technology will solve any of the problems that may have come along. So the answer is more, not less. Intensification of agriculture, faster development of genetically modified crops, the ongoing expansion of the great benefits of the Green Revolution. So the answer, more, not less, I think is something of a mantra. And perhaps you can see the connections here with, I think, certain forms of political discourse of how we think about addressing climate change and other issues. Economic growth is the key. Not only because this is the best way to lift people out of poverty, but because it provides the necessary context for decoupling ourselves from nature. So the manifesto calls for the liberation of nature from the economy. And I think that's a telling quote, because it means that in eco-modernist vision, the economy is not embedded within nature, but rather nature is embedded within the economy. So long as the economy grows and develops in the right direction, it can largely dispense with or find replacements for nature and natural resources. This is because human civilizations rest not on natural systems, but human ones. So energy generation, as you can imagine, the advocacy is for large centralized forms of energy, nuclear power. It's impossible, they say, for small scales of energy generation ever to meet our society's demand for energy. So they're quite dismissive of small-scale solar and anything else we might pursue apart from these large projects. So just to come to an end with this part, just to summarize, the solution to the consequences of modernity is more modernity. For Nordhaus, Bruckner, and other eco-modernists, technology opens up a new frontier that enables humanity to escape the limits that apply to other living systems. Now, I want to suggest some of the ways in which people who have actually engaged with eco-modernism or this sort of thought, some of the criticisms they have given, and then I'm going to turn to that kind of a Christian understanding of belonging and limits that might provide just a different vision of what our place in the world looks like. Now, eco-modernists are criticized, you might imagine, for their somewhat naive faith in technology and their use of what are, so far at least, rather limited examples, for example, of decoupling, where we just have certain measures of environmental impact graphed against economic growth. And above all, they are accused of propping up a totalizing narrative of what progress and development must look like, which tends to ignore both the systemic injustices of current economic arrangements and also, unfortunately, often demeans and caricatures alternative and indigenous ways of relating to the land. I think it's also proved difficult, and perhaps speaking as a former biologist here, for those trained in the life sciences to accept the notion that any organism, however highly evolved or co-evolved with technology, can finally escape the laws and constraints that apply everywhere else. Moreover, it might be wondered if it was possible to decouple ourselves entirely from nature. How would that separation not lead perhaps to alienation from nature and ultimately a lack of concern to care for whatever is left? I find it particularly interesting that eco-modernism's portrayal of godlike human beings who have the unique power and right to dominate the earth, to use it as they say fit, it sounds a lot like popular caricatures of Christianity. Christians claim that human beings are created in God's image, given dominion over the earth. And it's precisely this sort of anthropocentrism that led the historian Lynn White to say that this is at the root of our ecologic crisis. The Judeo-Christian worldview is what has led us to this crisis. So it's perhaps unsurprising that eco-modernism now faces similar criticisms from environmentalists for both its hubris and especially its human-centeredness. This faith in progress and the status quo this faith in technology and progress can also make eco-modernism seem like nothing but cheerleaders for the way things already are, for the things we're already pursuing. Now, it's not entirely fair because they do advocate for particular policies that will direct government investment in technological solutions to such things as climate change. But the overall message, and certainly the advice to every single person, is carry on as you were. Unless, of course, you're caught up in fads like sustainable agriculture or finding local sources for your food or thinking of different ways of generating your power. Or if you're a small farmer in India trying to hold out against corporate agriculture and multinational corporations. In such cases as these, the advice would be give in to the forces of modernization, of creative destruction, of industrialization, because these are the things that are our only hope for salvation. The eco-modernist vision of humanity's eventual decoupling from nature enables and even encourages most of us to go on in the pursuit of happiness through consumerism. There are no limits that need apply. And apart perhaps from the aesthetic appreciation of wild nature from a distance, attempts to deepen connections with the natural world and work within its limits are at best quaint and at worst backward, hindrances to humanity's progress. The temptation to seek our life from nature is to be resisted, because though we may have evolved from the earth, our future lies elsewhere. And let me draw one more parallel to certain forms of Christian piety. Just as eco-modernism and modernity in general seek to separate humanity from nature, so has Christianity sometimes driven a wedge between the spiritual and the material, and thus often has ironically enabled the unencumbered and unchallenging flourishing of greed. One of my favorite writers and poets, Wendell Berry, puts it this way, talking about Christians in particular context: no wonder so many sermons are devoted exclusively to, quote, spiritual subjects. If one is living by the tithes of history's most destructive economy, then the disembodiment of the soul becomes the chief of worldly conveniences. And so there's a way in which both certain streams of Christianity and eco-modernism is a convenient thing to believe, because it in a sense allows one to carry on the path that one is already on, and none of us likes to consider change. A theologian and expert in the study, oh yes, can I take questions as I'm going through? Is that, yes?
Trying to argue the rise of eco-modernism from a background of Christianity.
No, that's not what I'm doing. So what I'm suggesting is that there is an interesting parallel with where eco-modernism ends up and with certain streams of Christianity that decouple us from nature in the same way, that drive a wedge between the material and the spiritual in some forms of Christianity, and so lead to a lack of connection to the natural world and a lack of concern for the natural world, because we transcend it in some way. We transcend the natural. So what I'm suggesting is that that same trend that happens in Christianity, in a way, perhaps in an ironic way, eco-modernism in a way leads to, because it's a separation of nature and culture. So I'm just drawing a parallel. I'm not arguing for any kind of a genetic connection between the two. Does that help? Thank you. Emmanuel Kanangoli, who you see here, he's was born in Uganda as a theologian and expert in the history of Africa. He's pointed out that a peculiar marriage between modernity and Christianity, especially in the form of the prosperity gospel, has had much to do with the ecological and social crises in Africa. Kanangoli observes that Africans traditionally considered themselves to belong to an extended community of the living and the dead who had gone before. And it was the land itself that was the umbilical cord of that belonging, linking the present, the past, and the future. You are a part of this and you're connected through the soil itself. But for colonialists, moderns themselves, the land became associated with all that was primitive and had to be overcome. Christianity reinforced this notion by linking the land with animism and witchcraft. Therefore, life lived in connection with the soil lost its dignity. Success and prosperity were now to be found exclusively in the city. And in the process, land lost its value and its purpose. People lost their motivation to care for it. And so it became open to exploitation. According to Kanangoli, the modern notion of progress is always necessarily away from the land, away from place, away from community, has created what he has said is fundamentally a crisis of belonging. And it is a crisis, he says, that underlies the ecological and social crises in many parts of Africa. But here's where I got interested when I heard Kanangoli speak on this. He suggests that actually it's Christianity itself that offers a different and a better vision. A vision that's held out in the Christian scriptures, and one that Pope Francis actually has reminded the world of in his encyclical. Here, as Kanangoli points out, the Pope identifies the spiritual wound that lies at the heart of the ecological crisis as our inability to live as creatures made from dust, who belong to the earth and each other, hence the title, Our Common Home. And I think this is the fundamental question that faces us. In an age of both environmental crisis on the one hand, and techno-optimism and transhumanism on the other, do we consider ourselves creatures who belong to the earth, to our bodies, and to one another? It is only if we answer yes, and then seek to understand in what way we belong to the earth, that accepting any limits makes sense. So I think it's not surprising that the eco-modernists find it necessary to posit a divorce from what they call nature in order to advocate for a life without limits. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to suggest this one vision of belonging and limits given in the Christian biblical tradition. I offer this both as a corrective of what I consider misconstruals of the Christian tradition, and also as an example of the need for wider religious frameworks and narratives to orient us in this age of ecological collapse and techno-optimism. And the Christian scriptures, to belong to creation, to belong to each other, to belong to our own bodies even, is a gift. And to the extent that embracing limits enables us to belong, to love and honor God, even certain limits can be a gift. To escape from nature, then, would actually be a Pyrrhic victory in the Christian tradition. So, a rapid survey of this theme just through some of the scriptures of the Christian tradition. Limits serve in the first place simply to mark out boundaries, of course. Karl Barth said, only the void has limits. So in Genesis and Job and in the Psalms, creation involves God separating and setting limits so that different parts of creation might simply come into being and be distinguished from each other. Now, the most important of these distinctions for the Christian tradition is that between God and all else, God and all that is created. And human beings, quite obviously and clearly, fall on the created side of this distinction. They don't fall on the God side of that. In fact, in the Genesis story, human beings are created on the same day as the other land animals. They're one land animal among others, and they're created from the dust of the earth, Adam from the Adamah, and it is to the earth that human beings return at death. Even the praise that human beings give to God is not unique. So scripture from Psalms to Revelation celebrates all of creation praising God simply by being itself. All the natural world has its own agency, as we talked about earlier today at our seminar. Human beings actually are just invited to take their appropriate place in this cosmic choir and to offer their own praise to God that's already going on throughout all of the natural world. So the earth exists not just to serve humankind, but it exists first and last for God. And thus other creatures, in which God also delights and cares for, they find their appropriate place within creation. Psalm 104 celebrates this diversity of life. And I've just put a couple quotes from Psalm 104 because it's one that celebrates all these different parts of the natural world that the psalmist encounters. Humankind finds itself just one creature among others. Birds have their own space by the streams and in the trees. Mountains belong to the wild goats. Lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. Even the mythical Leviathan, this great emblem of wildness, is a creature God formed simply so it might frolic in the sea. In wisdom, the psalmist says, God made them all. So Scripture envisions human beings as being limited in the sense that they belong to the rest of the creation as one creature among others. And incidentally, early Christian thinkers such as Athanasius recognized that even in the story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and 3, human beings are created just as mortal creatures. They are not creatures who are going to live forever unless they take from the tree of life. The whole reason the story says they are excluded from the garden is so they may not do that. So by nature, they are mortal creatures, like other creatures return to the earth. Human days are limited. And wisdom comes with learning to count one's days. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament tells readers to think with sober judgment about themselves, with humility not to consider themselves something better than they are. The limitations inherent to being physical beings, bound in time and space, these are not the result of some fall from grace or a problem, but rather they are an intrinsic gift of belonging to a good creation. And if there was any doubts about the goodness of this given life, for Christian readers, the New Testament puts this to rest in the claim that the unlimited God actually takes on the limited life of flesh and blood in what Christians call the incarnation, and Jesus becoming a part of creation, he shows that this material world itself can be a fitting vehicle for the divine. To belong now to Christ is to belong to the in-flesh one, and so to belong again to our own bodies, to each other, and to the earth itself. Jesus also shows in the gospel narratives what it is to accept the goodness of a bounded human life. These are in the gospel narratives of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, where Jesus is weak and hungry, and he is tempted to fulfill his immediate desire for food by the easiest and most efficient means possible, no matter what the consequences may be, to use his divine power and turn stones into bread. Jesus refuses to grasp the power that could be his and to use it for his own ends. Instead, he voluntarily chooses restraint and the ordinary conditions of human life. And so too with the following two temptations. Jesus will not put God to the test, taking advantage of the divine protection that is his, nor will he choose the easy way of inheriting the kingdoms of this world. Instead, Jesus accepts the limitations of creaturely life and heads down a path that leads eventually to a cross. Mark's version of this story, which is just basically a sentence long, we also get a glimpse of the results of such faithfulness. Like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark describes this temptation as instigated by Satan, the accuser, and is ending with angels ministering to Jesus. But in between, Mark says Jesus was, quote, with the wild animals. Now, part of this could be part of the struggle that Jesus faces in the wilderness. But Mark says Jesus was with the wild animals. And for Jesus to be with someone, or for anyone to be with Jesus, is always a good thing in the rest of Mark's gospel. So as the biblical scholar Richard Bauckham has argued, Mark is probably alluding, in his typically very brief and cryptic way here, to what he sees as Jesus' way is ushering in this peaceable kingdom that had been visioned by the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, the kingdom that we brought in when God was king, by God's king. So Jesus is portrayed as restoring the relationship between humanity and nature, pointing the way towards the peaceable kingdom of God. And the rest of the New Testament suggests that the future that Scripture holds out is not a removal from nature or creation, but rather reconciliation. Reconciliation of humanity with God, humanity with each other, and indeed humanity with the earth too. Belonging is a gift then not only of creation in the beginning, or of life now, but of new creation. So what the biblical hope offers is not the transcendence of nature, nor escape from this world, but rather the redemption of this mortal life, taken up into the life of God. From the very beginning of the biblical text, the uniqueness of human beings, which Scripture does hold out, the distinctive value of human creatures, does not mean that they fail to belong to the rest of the world. It rather means that they have a particular role as rulers within the community of creation. Now, even human rule is not absolute. It is only on behalf of and under the supreme rule of God, the true owner of creation, for whom all things exist. It is in the service of this God that humankind finds their vocation, within the limits of their own time and place, described in Genesis as the working and keeping of the land where they are planted. In the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites were reminded of this vocation and of their particular place in God's economy through a regular cycle of Sabbath days of rest, seventh year fallowing of fields, jubilee years when debts were forgiven, and any land that had been accumulated as injustices grew up was given back. Such practices, if they were carried out, would require trust in God's provision. They would be reminders that life does not consist in the boundless pursuit of gain, that even good human work has its limits and is not an end in itself. The land may have been given to the Israelites as their homeland, and thus, in an important sense, they could be said to belong to that land. But the land did not belong to them. An Israelite farmer was considered a tenant farmer, one whose life and work was in service of God as the true owner and Lord of that land. In these and other texts, now you might notice there's an awareness of potential scarcity and injustice that might grow up. And because of that, it requires a cautiousness in one's actions, an attentiveness to limits, and a readiness to redress inequalities that might arise. There's examples of this elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In this command not to move boundary stones, to accumulate more and more space for yourself, field to field, house to house. Isaiah even suggests one will be lonely if one does that, continues expanding one's own place at the expense of others when it ends up being alone in the middle of the land. There's also restraints even on consumption in the Hebrew Bible that seem to acknowledge at least the possibility of future scarcity. So, for example, if you're gathering birds' eggs for food, you don't take the mother along with the eggs. An obvious precaution, you might say, to maintain a sustainable harvest, as we would describe it. But the biblical writer is well aware of the temptation to assume that there are always plenty of other birds to lay their eggs. To take this one won't matter much in the big scheme of things. But in the biblical tradition, each small act is seen within a context of belonging to an interdependent community in which such acts can and do matter, and where the guides for your actions is wisdom, love for others, and a recognition of your mutual dependence. The same principle applies in the New Testament, in Paul's instructions to some Christ followers in the city of Corinth to give out of their abundance to provide for those in Palestine who do not have enough. The goal, Paul says, is equality. Here again, accepting limits for oneself are for the sake of sharing with others to whom you belong. For Paul, there is hope that the ethnically diverse churches scattered around the Mediterranean would all see themselves as part of the one body of Christ, all equal and interdependent. But as such texts remind us of the realism of Scripture, about the potential of inequality and injustice, I find it interesting that these same sorts of principles apply even in context of unlimited abundance. The importance of restraint in the face of abundance is one that Israel learned in the wilderness. Israel is said to have been saved out of the iron-smelting furnace of Egypt, where a type of industrial economy prevailed in which the elite few controlled and managed the land and its resources for their own benefit at the expense of everyone else, especially their Hebrew slaves. But in the wilderness, God's people find themselves living in daily dependence upon God's direct provision. Every day, except for the Sabbath day, God gives them manna, bread from heaven, as much or more than they need. And the temptation in the face of such bounty is to take extra, to store some for the future, maybe for yourself, maybe to sell to others, to secure yourself against the risk of future scarcity. But to do so in this context would be to abandon trust in the God who saved them out of Egypt, and to risk returning to an economy that is based on scarcity, fear, disparity, and inequality. In the New Testament, in fact, John says that Jesus reveals this abundance of God's kingdom. He feeds 5,000 with nothing more than 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Yet, after everyone has eaten their fill, Jesus tells his disciples, gather up everything that's left. Let nothing be wasted. It seems astonishing here in a context of overflowing, apparently limitless abundance. The gifts of God are not to be disdained, left to rot, or wasted. Jesus' followers are called to carefulness and restraint that affects awareness of their own creatureliness, their dependence and gratefulness for what is given, taking life and creation and nature as a gift rather than as a given. So the economy of God's kingdom is based finally on abundance, not on scarcity. The embrace of limits and restraint, then, is possible in the biblical tradition only because of a more fundamental reordering of desire. The unlimited desire of human beings can never be satisfied by the accumulation of things. And so the apparent, I say, sacrifice involved in the acceptance of limits and restraint becomes, in reality, a way for people to acknowledge that true joy and abundance is found elsewhere. Thus, it is in John's gospel that Jesus claims to have come so that his followers may have life and have it to the full. Now, I'm going to conclude with just a few reflections on potential implications of such a biblical vision that I've sketched so briefly and cursorily, bringing into conversation a bit with environmental ethics and some of the questions raised by Eco Modernism. First, obviously, according to the tradition I've just sketched here, human beings belong to and are dependent upon nature. Even in its eschatological visions, its visions of the future, the Christian scriptures do not look for disembodiment or the abandonment of creation. Now, this does not necessitate a Christian rejection, for example, of eco-modernism's hope of decoupling economic activity or human activity from nature. to the extent that this means merely the lessening of impact of human activities on the environment. But at a minimum, it calls into question any vision of the world where the aim of humanity is to so-called ascend from nature, and where in the meantime, as we wait for that day, the non-human world goes on being degraded and abused, and where absolute faith and salvation is simply handed over to technology. Now, more positively, I think the Christian tradition would acknowledge with eco-modernists that one way humanity can ensure the thriving of other creatures is to leave them space. Space is something that the Hebrew Bible already suggests needs to be apportioned fairly in order to care for your neighbor. And space is actually, interestingly, the one limit that eco-modernists are prepared to accept in human development. Of course, this is because of the fact, if you're a biologist, that biodiversity is nearly always far higher in places where we neither build nor plant crops. And there are certain creatures that simply thrive best when they have space away from intensive human impact. So if, as the Christian tradition suggests, other creatures have their own value before God, and therefore ought to be valued by followers of that God, then Christians could welcome land sparing as one way to exercise restraint, to give space for other life, to accept limits on ourselves. And I think such places can be reminders that the world does not exist merely for humankind. In the human-centered and virtual worlds that we create for ourselves, this is easy to forget. And it's in wild places that can be liminal places where there is an encounter with the divine. As Job discovered, and as Henry David Thoreau famously observed, human beings can see their own limits transgressed in such places. Even just walking up Sharp Peak yesterday, it didn't seem like that hard a hike, but the heat and humidity made me feel like I was almost dying climbing up. So my limits were being transgressed as I walked up that hill. It's a good reminder that one does not live at the center of the universe. All things are not made for me. It might also be that by studying the way of life in such places, that we can also turn back to our humanized landscapes and have a measure by which to assess them. How do we live in this particular place? What are the things that grow well here? Rather than seeking transcendence or escape and being willing to sacrifice the land and other creatures, or either here or somewhere else, simply for ourselves. For those willing to embrace the boundaries of this mortal life and accept the challenge of finding their vocation here and now in this time and place, I think there's another implication for environmental ethics. I alluded earlier that some may be tempted to take their ethical direction from the vast sweep of the Earth's evolutionary history, or maybe from projections of what we think the trajectory of human development and progress might be in the future. And Christians as well are sometimes tempted to construct their ethics from a notion of what they think the future new creation might be like, while failing to acknowledge the goodness of the given world that we encounter now. Though the conviction that the new creation has begun in Christ is indeed transformative for Christian belief and practice, the duty to love and care applies right now and in this place. I noted earlier that the questions that arise for environmental philosophers about how to value and care for a world that we now recognize, as Job already had, operates at scales unimaginably larger than ourselves, and in ways that can seem, from our limited human standpoint, chaotic, destructive, wild, and dangerous. But perhaps our place in such a creation as this, in such a natural world as this, is in part to learn humility, the limitations of our knowledge, to accept the limitations of our knowledge, and to accept responsibility to do work in the time that is given to us, to seek to preserve and sustain not some artificial harmony of nature exactly, but rather creation's dynamic resilience, its mosaic of changing landscapes and the creatures we share this world with. Though it may not end here, our duty of love and care begins with this place and in this time. When it comes to technology, just a couple of final points here, eco-modernism tends to present a binary choice. Either reject it or uncritically accept it. I think it's interesting because this is just what modernity did. Nature and culture were two entirely different spheres. Either it enabled the unrestrained exploitation of nature for one's own ends, or it meant for the Romantics the rejection of technology as inherently unnatural. The biblical tradition, by contrast, celebrates culture and technology. from music to agriculture to the study of nature, even to mining, and Job to architecture to cities. Yet science, culture, and technology are caught up in all the ambiguities of the rest of life. They too can be turned to good or to evil. So for every story of a Noah's Ark, technology to save and preserve life, there is a story of a Tower of Babel. For every New Jerusalem, a Babylon. So biblical Christianity is suspicious of totalizing narratives. It encourages humility to accept that we are always more ignorant than we know. And it also challenges us, no matter what, to stand with the oppressed, the poor, and the weak. Precisely because in the Christian tradition, transcendence is limited only to God, it prompts a pragmatism that is unwilling to worship any particular economic or even environmental ideology, but rather seeks to imagine how the kingdom of God is to be cultivated here and now. So my final point is to question what we mean by optimism. Some of you might know this recent book by Steven Pinker, the Harvard linguist, Enlightenment Now. I see some of you nodding your heads. It celebrates many themes which we fail to acknowledge too often. How much progress we have made, how many people have been lifted from poverty, how much good there is in the world right now. And it's right to call attention to those things, especially perhaps in our days of constant despair. But optimism can sometimes be a substitute for actually looking attentively at the real challenges we also still face, and simply a way of excusing ourselves from taking up our responsibility. And there are other ways than techno-optimism, than eco-modernism, to be optimistic about the earth and its future. Whereas eco-modernists are optimistic about technology and human creativity, they seem profoundly pessimistic about the possibility of changing human hearts and human desires. I think one of the roles of religion is to suggest alternative ways of seeing the world, other ways of seeing ourselves. Religions can propose different means of measuring progress and asking what it means to flourish, what is the good life. And religion can hold out the possibility of transformation. So in Christianity, and its view of human brokenness, it has an acknowledgement of eco-modernism's pessimism about human nature left to itself. In fact, in its recognition of our always fraught relationship with technology and with wealth, I think Christianity is actually more realistic than eco-modernism. But above all, and I'll end with this, Christianity is rooted in the conviction that genuine transformation of the human heart is possible, and that human desire can never be fulfilled simply by the endless pursuit of more. Thank you.